Koning Vajiralongkorn is nu officieel 4 jaar koning van Thailand. In die tijd is er veel gebeurd. Onder zijn volk ontstaat er steeds meer onvrede die ze tot nu toe niet konden uiten. In Thailand staan nog steeds hoge celstraffen op majesteitsschennis. En dat geeft de koning enorm veel bewegingsvrijheid. De 68-jarige Thaise koning leidt al jaren een leven vol luxe en vreemde uitspattingen in Duitsland. Zijn vermogen wordt geschat op vele miljarden. Hij houdt van het gezelschap van vrouwen. Naast zijn 4 vrouwen met wie hij getrouwd was, heeft hij openlijk minnaressen die hij op vooraanstaande posities zet. Op privé-uitstapjes draagt de vorst graag nietsverhullende topjes. Als foto's daarvan op Facebook circuleren, dreigt hij het medium te blokkeren. De Thaise vorst valt in zijn land op door zijn afwezigheid. Hij verblijft maar een paar dagen per jaar in Thailand. Vorige week brengt hij met zijn huidige vrouw, koningin Suthida, een bliksembezoek aan zijn land op Mahidoldag om zijn grootvader te eren. In die korte tijd haalt hij ook snel wat achterstallig werk in en beëdigt hij nog even 18 ambassadeurs. Sinds 2016 woont de koning hier in Hotel Sonnebiegel in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. Met een door hem in het leven geroepen militair regiment dat uit 20 jonge vrouwen bestaat. Terwijl hij in luxe geniet in Duitsland, rommelt het in Thailand. Het volk lijdt onder de gevolgen van de coronacrisis en pikt het niet langer. De demonstranten willen dat er minder geld naar de monarchie gaat en dat de macht van de koning beperkt wordt. Dit keer laten zij zich niet tegenhouden door het verbod op majesteitsschennis. Ja, vlak voor de uitzending sprak ik met Andrew Macgregor Marshall in Edinburgh, Schotland. Hij is internationaal gezien dé deskundige als het gaat om de Thaise monarchie. Hij schreef er een boek over en staat dagelijks in contact met de mensen die demonstreren in Bangkok. Good evening, Mr. Marshall. Yeah, we see a lot of protest in Bangkok, Thailand. People want more democracy and a reform of the monarchy. So what do you think? How will this end?
It's hard to see it ending peacefully, unfortunately, because it looks very unlikely that the monarchy or the military would be willing to give up their kind of outsized grip on power. Even though Thailand is supposedly a democracy now, the palace and the armed forces still play a huge role in Thai politics and try to control the game from behind the scene. And the protesters want this to change. They want the palace to stop interfering in politics. They want the army to go back to the barracks. But it seems very unlikely that the generals and the king will be willing to do that. So that's why many observers, including me, are afraid we might see another confrontation, more violence on the streets of Bangkok, as we've seen several times before in Thai history.
So for many years, the King of Thailand has lived, not in Thailand, but in Germany. So my question is, what attracts him there?
Yeah, it's a good question. He's lived there for about 13 years, since 2007. And there are several reasons for that. The first one is that, as you know, he has had a rather colourful private life. He's been through a series of wives and mistresses. The second reason is that your viewers may have seen some photographs of the king in Germany. He's quite notorious for often going out wearing eccentric clothing, crop tops, fake tattoos, and so on, going cycling with very little clothes on. Now, there's no way he could do that in Thailand. He simply could not go out about in Thailand dressed like that. But in Germany, he can get away with it.
Yeah. So you're mentioning the women. There are reports that a number of women live with him in a hotel in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, one of his favorite locations in the south of Germany. But is it true that these women are there just to please him?
Yes. I mean, in history, Thai monarchs had very large harems. So a few centuries ago, it would be normal for a Thai king to have, scores of wives and concubines, sometimes more than 100. But in the modern era, this stopped. But the current king, Vajiralongkorn, he seems to have resurrected this. So the information about his harem, whom he lives with in Bavaria, comes from really good sources within the palace. And we can confirm some of the information because they've all been given the same surname. Which basically means in Thai, women who serve the king.
Wow. Well, there's much to say about the King of Thailand, especially his absence is striking even more in this time of global crisis. Is there nevertheless something that he's doing good for his country?
In this case, it's hard to find anything. You know, one of the problems with monarchy can be that now and again it throws up a terrible air about whom you can't say much good. And I think in this case, this has happened with Thailand.
Yeah, so demonstrations are going on, even planned for, I believe, next week. Will the king listen to the people's call for a modern monarchy?
The Thai monarchy, I would say, is really in its end game, because the king is 68, and when he dies, there's no obvious successor who could wield anything like the same power and influence that he does. So he's almost fighting a futile battle to hang on to this medieval-style monarchical power, when in fact the Thai monarchy will have to reform sooner or later. It's just a question of how long it takes.
Yeah, so do you expect that the king will decide to be in Thailand more often as demonstrations continue?
It seems quite likely. We know from my palace sources that he's flying back to Bangkok on the 9th of October. And unlike his previous visits over the past year, where he's never even spent a night in Thailand, we know he's going to spend several weeks in the country throughout October, and he may come back in November also. He's also building a huge palace complex in the heart of Bangkok, which you'll have to live in at one stage. So it does seem quite possible he'll be taking a more hands-on role. And that's quite worrying for the prospects of stability too, because if the king's in Bangkok, tensions will be even higher as these protests continue.
Well, okay. Thank you very much, Andrew Macgregor Marshall, for this interview and your time. Thank you for attending from Edinburgh.